You don't think on your own, not in the way you imagine. There is a simple thought experiment. Try sitting down, with nothing arriving from outside, and sustaining a single thought for 15 minutes. Not a vague thought, a specific thought, one you chose, one you want to examine with depth. An idea that interests you, a question that was left open, something you haven't yet resolved, and that you genuinely want to resolve. How long can you go before something else enters? Before the mind jumps to what needs to be answered, verified, checked, processed? Before the urgency of some external stimulus waiting in line overcomes the resistance of the thought you were trying to sustain? For most people, the honest answer is disturbing. Not because they are incapable of thinking, but because they have never been confronted with the evidence that their capacity to sustain their own thinking was progressively fragmented by an architecture designed for exactly that purpose. You didn't lose the capacity to think with depth. It was taken from you, not by force, but by engineering, piece by piece, interruption by interruption, fragment by fragment, over enough time for the fragmented state to seem normal. But the fragmentation of attention is not the inevitable cost of modern life. It is the product of an economy that profits from it, and the beneficiaries of that economy have a structural incentive for you never to notice what is being extracted. There is a cognitive state that you probably recognize, but rarely name with precision. It is not tiredness. It is not boredom. It is the specific feeling of having spent an entire day in motion, responding, reacting, processing, participating, and arriving at the end with the perception that nothing you did had the depth you know you are capable of producing. You spent hours in a state of intense activity, but the activity was surface level, fast, reactive, fragmented. Every task was interrupted before it was fully inhabited. Every idea was started before it was fully developed. Every conversation was only partially present because part of your attention was already ahead on the next thing. And at the end of the day, what remains is not the satisfaction of having done. It is a kind of cognitive fog, a fatigue that doesn't feel like the tiredness of genuine effort, but like the tiredness of having processed volume without depth, as if you spent the day swimming in a shallow sea of information and arrived at the shore without having descended to any real depth. This state has a precise cause and an identifiable beneficiary, and the cause is not you. Observe the pattern in your own days with clinical attention. You have an idea. It is genuinely good. You feel that in the moment it appears. There is something there that deserves to be developed, examined, taken somewhere. You begin to think. And at some point between the beginning and where the idea could arrive, something comes in from the outside. A question, a notification, the memory of something that was left unanswered, an interruption that is the size of a second but has the effect of breaking the thread. And when you return, when the interruption ends and you try to resume the thought, the thread is no longer exactly where it was. You need to rebuild the context, retrace the chain, recover the cognitive state that the interruption undid. And often, in that process of reconstruction, the idea loses the texture it had in the moment it arose. It becomes thinner, more predictable, closer to what you already knew than to what you might have discovered. This didn't happen once. It happens dozens of times a day. And the accumulated result of a life of fragmented thinking is not just reduced productivity. It is a version of you that is intellectually smaller than what was possible, with fewer developed ideas than you could have had, with less deep understanding than you would have been capable of building, with less authority over your own thinking than your capacity would allow. Observe also what happens with your reading. You pick up a book you genuinely want to read, a book that asks for real attention, one that requires you to follow a complex argument for pages, to build a structure of comprehension as you advance. You begin, and at some point, sometimes a few paragraphs in, sometimes a few pages in, you realize that your eyes are moving, but your mind is somewhere else. The text passes, the words are recognized, but comprehension is not being built. You go back, literally go back in the text, reread it, and even then the adhesion is partial. This is not a lack of intelligence. It is the result of an attention system that was trained over time to jump at short intervals, to process in flashes, not in flows, to react, not to sustain. And when you try to use it for the kind of thinking that requires sustaining, deep reading, genuine reflection, creation that starts from nothing, it resists, not because it is incapable, because it was conditioned differently. Who conditioned it and why? These questions have answers, and the answers point to something that most people never consider because the dominant narrative is different. The dominant narrative says, you have difficulty focusing because you are impulsive, because you lack discipline, because you don't have enough willpower to resist distractions. The problem in that narrative is always individual. A character flaw, a personal deficiency, a weakness that must be corrected by more effort. But there is an American researcher and author who spent years documenting a radically different hypothesis. The problem is not individual. It is infrastructural. The fragmentation of attention is not the background noise of modern life. It is the product of an economy that was built specifically to produce it. And those who profit from fragmentation have a structural interest in your continuing to believe that the problem is yours. When you understand his argument, with all its precision and all its brutality, the crisis of authority over your own attention stops looking like personal weakness and starts looking like what it is, the predictable result of having been inserted into a system of cognitive extraction without anyone telling you that the extraction was happening. Cal Newport is a professor of computer science at Georgetown and spent more than a decade studying a phenomenon that most people experience but few can name with precision: the systematic destruction of the human capacity to think with depth. He is not a philosopher in the classical sense, but the diagnosis he constructed has a philosophical radicality that most contemporary philosophers do not reach, because it starts from data, from concrete observations about what happens to the human mind when inserted into an architecture of fragmented attention, and arrives at conclusions that completely reposition the question of cognitive authority. The central concept of Newport's work is what he calls deep work, deep thinking, the cognitive state in which you are completely absorbed in a task that demands all of your mental capacity, without fragmentation, without interruption, without attention divided between what you are doing and what you could be doing. It is the state in which great ideas emerge, in which genuine understanding is built, in which you produce something that is not merely a recombination of what already exists, but the creation of something new. Newport demonstrates that this state is not merely valuable, it is the most valuable cognitive state a human being can inhabit. It is where writers truly write, where musicians truly compose, where thinkers truly think, where any person produces the best of what they are capable of producing. It is the territory in which the human mind operates at the limit of its capacity, and therefore the only territory in which it can transcend what it already is. And this state, the most valuable, the most human, the most irreducibly personal, was identified as a threat by an economy that needs fragmented attention to function. Not a moral threat, an economic threat. A mind in a state of deep work is not available for capture. It is not being measured, monetized, segmented. It is out of reach of the extraction system. And so, the system built with engineering precision, the infrastructure necessary for deep work to become increasingly rare, increasingly difficult, increasingly perceived as an inaccessible luxury rather than a natural capacity that any human being can cultivate. Newport is not an alarmist. He is surgical, and what he documented, with data and with a clarity that unsettles, is that the crisis of authority over one's own attention is not accidental. It is designed, and designs have designers. Let's open the mechanism with precision. Newport starts from a distinction that seems obvious and is devastating when examined honestly. There is shallow thinking, and there is deep thinking. Not as a qualitative judgment about content, as a description of the cognitive state in which each occurs. Shallow thinking is the thinking that occurs in a state of fragmentation. You process, respond, react, connect known pieces of information in already established ways. It is fast, it is efficient for certain tasks, and it is completely incapable of producing the kind of understanding that only emerges when the mind is sustained on a problem long enough to go beyond what it already knows. Deep thinking is the structural opposite. It requires you to remain with a problem, an idea, a text, a composition, for long enough for something new to appear, something that wasn't available at the start, that emerged from the process of sustaining. It is slow, it is uncomfortable in the first minutes, because the mind trained for fragmentation resists sustaining, and it is the only state in which genuine understanding is built. Now, observe the proportion in which each of these states occurs in your life. How much of your thinking time happens in a state of fragmentation, responding, reacting, jumping between fragments of information and attention? And how much happens in a state of deep sustaining, completely inside a single idea for long enough to go beyond the starting point? For most people who inhabit the contemporary world, the honest answer is that the deep state is the exception, not the rule. It can appear in accidental moments, on a long walk with no destination, on a sleepless night when the mind finally quiets, on an afternoon when by some chance the interruptions didn't arrive. But as a deliberate, cultivated, sustained state, as territory inhabited regularly, it has disappeared. And Newport identifies the precise mechanism by which it disappeared, not the individual willpower that failed to maintain it, but the surrounding architecture that made it increasingly difficult to access. An architecture that normalizes interruption, that rewards reactivity, that makes the fragmented state the state of least resistance, and that makes the deep state require ever greater effort to access until most people simply give up trying. The result is not visible all at once. It is cumulative. A life of fragmented thinking produces a version of you with fewer developed ideas of your own, less understanding built from within, less cognitive authority over what you think and how you think, because the territory where that authority is built was progressively occupied by the logic of fragmentation, and here is the inversion that Newport's diagnosis demands. The problem is not that you don't have enough discipline to resist distractions. The problem is that you are inserted into an architecture designed to produce exactly the state you are trying to overcome with individual discipline. You are using personal willpower to resist system engineering. And system engineering always wins in the long run. The digital economy doesn't sell products to you. It buys something from you, and what it buys is attention. Every minute your mind is available for capture is converted into data, into segmentation, into influence over what you think, want, and choose. Newport is precise. Fragmented and available human attention is the raw material of one of the most profitable industries in history. You are not the consumer of this system. You are the resource it extracts. And like any resource, it is worth more when abundant and less when scarce. The abundance of your attention is what the system needs. The scarcity, concentrated, deep, unavailable for capture attention, is what threatens it. The system doesn't distract by accident. It distracts because distraction is the means by which it converts your time into revenue. Normalized interruption is not the collateral cost of a connected world. It is the deliberate architecture of a system that needs your attention to always be partially available. Every notification, every signal that something is awaiting a response, every structure that makes immediate reactivity the expected behavior, these are mechanisms of maintaining fragmentation, not design flaws. Newport documents the concrete cognitive cost of each interruption, not only the time lost to the interruption itself, but the time required to reconstruct the previous cognitive state, which can be 20 minutes or more for genuine deep thinking. A single interruption every 20 minutes makes deep thinking structurally impossible, regardless of the person's willpower. The system that produces this cadence of interruption is not careless. It is precise, and you were inserted into it without a manual. Newport identifies an asymmetry that defines the contemporary moment. The capacity for deep thinking is simultaneously becoming rarer and more valuable. Rarer, because the architecture of fragmentation destroys it systematically. More valuable because it is the only type of cognitive capacity that cannot be easily automated, replicated, or replaced. The thinking that any system can do for you is shallow thinking, recombination of what already exists, response to recognizable patterns, processing of information within established structures. The thinking that no system can do for you is deep thinking, the genuine understanding that emerges from prolonged sustaining of a specific problem. And the brutal irony is that the same culture that systematically destroyed your capacity for deep thinking now rewards the rare few who can still access it. You were deprived of your most valuable asset without realizing you possessed it. Now the diagnosis deepens to the layer that bothers most, because it is the most honest about what was lost and who lost it. Newport has an observation that appears in different forms throughout his work, and that condenses the central paradox of the contemporary moment. Cognitive depth is the only territory in which a human being can produce something genuinely their own. Not a recombination of what already exists, not a response to a recognizable pattern, not a reproduction of something the system could already produce without you, but something that emerged from the singularity of your mind in a state of deep sustaining. And that territory, the only one where genuine originality is possible, is exactly what was colonized. Think about the last time you had an idea that surprised you yourself, not an idea that arrived already formed, that recombined what you already knew in a predictable way, an idea that emerged from inside a process of sustained thinking, one you didn't know you were going to have before you had it, one that appeared because you stayed with a problem long enough to go beyond what you already knew about it. For many people, locating that moment requires considerable retrospection, not because they are incapable of having original ideas, but because the cognitive state in which those ideas emerge was progressively eliminated from their routine, replaced by states of shallow processing that are easier to sustain in an architecture of constant fragmentation. And here is what Newport identifies as the deepest dimension of the crisis of cognitive authority. You didn't just lose the capacity to think deeply in an efficient way. You progressively lost the sense of what you were losing. The fragmented mind doesn't perceive fragmentation as loss. It perceives it as normal. The superficial state of shallow processing becomes the reference state, and deep thinking, when it happens by accident, seems exceptional, difficult, almost unattainable as a deliberate state. This is the most perfect capture mechanism that exists, the one that makes the captured forget they were captured. But there is still a deeper layer, and Newport documents it with a precision that unsettles. The fragmentation of attention doesn't only affect what you produce, it affects what you are capable of thinking about your own life. The most important questions a human being can ask, about what they want, about what they value, about what truly matters, about who they are becoming, are questions that require the cognitive state that fragmentation destroys. They cannot be answered in flashes of shallow attention. They require sustaining. They require you to stay with the question long enough for something deeper than the immediate and convenient answer to emerge. When that state is systematically eliminated, when the mind is always partially available for the next interruption, always on alert for the next stimulus, always divided between what it is doing and what it could be doing, the fundamental questions are not answered wrongly. They simply never fully get formulated. They remain in a latent state, started and abandoned before reaching anywhere. And the cumulative result of a life of fundamental questions never fully formulated is exactly what you can recognize if you look honestly: a diffuse disorientation about who you are and where you are headed, which has no identifiable cause in any specific event, but that persists as a background fog, because the cognitive tools necessary to dispel that fog are the same ones that were systematically taken from you. Newport does not say that fragmentation was designed specifically to produce this result. He says something more disturbing, that the system did not need to concern itself with the existential consequences of fragmentation, because the focus was on extracting attention in the short term. The long-term consequences, the erosion of cognitive authority, the progressive inability to think with depth about one's own life, are externalities, costs that you pay and that the system registers in no balance sheet. You pay the cost, the system registers the profit, and the asymmetry is perfect because you never received the contract. We've reached the core, and it is more disturbing than what came before because it is the most direct. You have difficulty focusing not because you are weak. You have difficulty focusing because you were inserted into an architecture of fragmentation designed with engineering precision to produce exactly that result, and because the dominant narrative about that difficulty attributes to you the responsibility for a state that was produced by a system. The crisis of authority that Newport diagnoses is dual and precise. You lost authority over how your attention is allocated. It is captured before you decide where it goes. And you lost awareness that this loss has an identifiable beneficiary. As long as you believe the problem is your lack of discipline, you keep looking for the solution in yourself, in more willpower, more technique, more individual effort, and the system keeps operating untouched. The inversion the diagnosis demands is this: the problem is not in you, it is in the architecture, and architectures are built by people with specific interests. The architecture that fragments your attention was built by industries that profit from fragmentation, that need your attention to be available for capture, divided among multiple focuses, never completely inside anything that doesn't pass through the extraction system. A mind in a state of genuine deep thinking is not available for capture. It is closed to the exterior, inside itself, inside the problem, inside the process. It is economically useless to the system while it is in that state. And so the system built a culture that calls that state unproductive, antisocial, disconnected, that rewards reactivity as virtue and punishes depth as luxury, that makes the person capable of sustained deep thinking seem, in the contemporary context, almost archaic, as if they had failed to adapt to the rhythm of the world. You did not fail to adapt. You were adapted for a system that prefers your attention fragmented. And now, you know the difference. Now the phenomenon is entirely readable. The difficulty of focusing that you experience is not a diagnosis of what you are. It is the predictable and documented result of having been inserted into an architecture of cognitive fragmentation, an architecture built with the specific objective of keeping your attention available for capture, and that produced as a structural consequence the progressive erosion of your capacity for deep thinking. Newport is not describing an individual pathology. He is describing what inevitably happens to any human being when inserted for long enough into an infrastructure designed to prevent the cognitive state in which the mind operates at the limit of its capacity. The crisis of authority is real, and it is dual. You lost control over how your attention is allocated, and you lost the perception that this loss serves a logic that is not yours. Both losses have the same effect. You remain inside the system without being able to see the system. And as long as you can't see it, you keep attributing to personal character what is a product of infrastructure. That distinction between individual failure and product of a system is what the diagnosis delivers, not as relief, not as an excuse, but as precision. The problem has an address, and the address is not you. Look back with this diagnosis active and see what it reorganizes. Every time you tried to focus and failed and concluded that the problem was you, that you needed more discipline, more willpower, more resistance effort, you are using individual willpower against system engineering. And system engineering always has a structural advantage over individual willpower because engineering operates continuously without fatigue while willpower exhausts itself. Every time you ended a day exhausted without having produced anything with the depth you know you are capable of, and felt the diffuse guilt of having wasted the day despite having been busy the entire time, you were experiencing the asymmetry that Newport documents. You were kept in high activity of low depth, which is exhausting to the mind but productive to the extraction system. Every time an idea began to emerge and was interrupted before reaching anywhere, and you didn't notice the loss, because the interruption happened in such a normalized way that it didn't feel like an interruption, it just felt like life. You were ceding cognitive territory to a system that needed exactly that territory. Newport cites historical examples that illuminate the contrast with precision. Carl Jung building the tower at Bollingen, a house with no electricity, no telephone, where he went regularly to think without interruption. Mark Twain, writing in a cabin in the family garden, isolated enough that the mind could sustain the state the work required. Not as romanticism of isolation, as a structural condition for the kind of thinking that the fragmented state makes impossible. Those people did not have more willpower than you. They had access to an architecture that allowed the cognitive state that your current architecture prevents. The difference was not one of character, it was one of infrastructure. And the question that contrast raises is less about the past and more about the present. To what degree was the architecture around you built by you to serve what you genuinely value, and to what degree was it built by others to serve what they need to extract? Newport leaves a tension open that doesn't close with a solution. The attention economy exists because human attention has value, and it has value precisely because it is the only resource that cannot be replicated, increased, or substituted by any other resource. It is what you have in finite quantity that determines what you truly experience, think, create, and become over the course of a life. Attention is the field where life happens, not metaphorically, literally. What you pay attention to is what exists for you. What escapes your attention simply does not exist in your experience, however much it exists in the world. And so what captures your attention captures, in a precise sense, your life. Now the question that remains, with no answer I can give you, who actually decides how your attention is allocated throughout a day, you or the architecture around you? And if you could see, in real time, the map of where your attention went in every hour of the past few weeks, would you recognize that map as the life you would choose to have? Newport believes that the crisis of cognitive authority is the most important crisis the contemporary generation faces, because it is the crisis that determines whether the other important questions of existence will be thought through with enough depth to produce real clarity, or processed in a sufficiently fragmented state to never arrive anywhere. Deep attention is not productivity. It is the only state in which life can be truly thought through. Are you truly thinking through yours? Newport offers no consolation at the end, and neither will this screenplay, because the diagnosis you moved through cancels nothing. The fragmentation architecture continues to operate. The extraction system continues to function. The normalization of interruption continues to be the default protocol of almost every environment you inhabit. Nothing changed on the outside. What changed is that you can no longer call the difficulty of focusing a personal weakness without knowing deep down that you are using that explanation to avoid examining the system that produced it. You can no longer attribute to character what is a product of engineering without realizing that that attribution is precisely what the system needs to keep operating without resistance. The crisis of authority over one's own attention does not begin to be reversed with technique. It begins to be reversed with visibility, with the recognition that your attention is worth more than you imagine, that it is being extracted, and that the agents of extraction have every interest in your continuing to believe that the problem is you. Antidote doesn't give you your attention back. It gives you the name of who is harvesting it. If this diagnosis touched something you want to keep examining, if the question stayed with you, leave a comment. The next video is already being prepared.